Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catalyze Yourself. I'm Gayatri, your host, and today we move into episode 24 of our season 3, when justification replaces compassion, which is just another conditioned pattern that can shape what we allow ourselves to choose when we are under pressure. Our ability to justify. And most of us do not move through life thinking we are people who can justify just about anything. We tend to think of justification as something obvious, an excuse someone offers when they know they have done something questionable, a story created to avoid responsibility, a deliberate attempt to make something unacceptable appear acceptable. And justification can certainly show up that way. It can also show up through explanations that are thoughtful, emotionally sincere, factually supported, and just deeply convincing to us. Because we can find a way to justify almost anything we want. Our choices, belief, behavior, relationships, our outcome, just so it can remain acceptable. We can use our circumstances. We can use our intention. We can use what another person did first. We can use what we have endured. We can use our role, our responsibilities, our values, our fear, our loyalty, our need for stability, or even our compassion. When we pay attention to the explanations we hear around us, and the ones we form within ourselves, we can begin to notice how completely opposite choices can each be, and it's still made to sound reasonable, depending on the side that is presenting the acceptable narrative. We can justify staying because commitment matters. We can justify leaving because self-respect matters. We can justify speaking because honesty matters. We can justify remaining silent because we do not want to create unnecessary pain. We can justify stepping back because people need to learn through their own experiences. We can justify continuing to give someone access and support because we understand what they have lived through. We can justify ending access because understanding their history does not remove the impact of their behavior. We can justify taking control because the situation needs leadership. And any one of those choices may reflect discernment in the situation where it has been made. And any one of them can also become something we justify because it gives us the outcome we already want, protects an identity we value, or relieves an internal pressure we do not want to continue carrying. When we think through our experiences in life, we can see this pattern showing up in reasonable ways. We may have known people who had access to resources another person genuinely needed. The resource may have been money, knowledge, influence, time, access, opportunity, or maybe simply a connection that could have made an important difference. And still, the resource was withheld. And the acceptable explanation may have been presented as benevolence. Helping would coddle the person. Struggle would teach them. They needed to become more self-sufficient. Providing support would prevent them from learning a lesson that life was trying to teach them. The language of benevolence could make withholding the resource feel compassionate without requiring further examination of the actual scenario. The explanation created a stable internal conclusion. I am not denying help. I'm helping them learn. Once that conclusion was accepted, the person's current capacity, the severity of the need, the consequences of receiving no support, the power difference between the people involved, and whether the struggle was actually likely to teach what was being claimed, no longer seemed to carry the same influence. Compassion had not necessarily disappeared. The person withholding support may have sincerely believed they were being compassionate, but compassion had been defined in such a precise way that supported the choice that they already wanted to make. Now let's look at a different scenario that many of us could have experienced. Let us look at an organization where poor business decisions has accumulated over time. Information was available, risks were visible, people raised concerns within the organization, investments were being made without the required examination, a direction was continued long after evidence began showing up that it was not producing what had been expected. And then one fine day, the financial cost becomes undeniable. And at that point, the organization starts looking at the clearest and fastest expense to reduce. Employees are let go. Again, workforce reductions can be necessary. Organizations do encounter changing markets, declining revenue, structural inefficiencies, and realities that require painful decisions. Agreed. However, leadership does include responsibility for organizational viability. This conditioned pattern becomes visible when the language of responsible leadership is used to make the final decision appear separate from the decisions that created the conditions for it. The explanations may emphasize protecting the business. It may emphasize acting decisively. It may emphasize accountability, efficiency, or the greater good. What can receive much less attention is who had the authority to shape the earlier decisions, who raised concerns that were not allowed to influence the direction, who benefited while the strategy was being pursued, and who is now being asked to absorb the consequences. The justification allows the final action to be described as strong leadership without requiring the leadership choices that preceded it to remain fully inside the same examination. And this is also why justification can be so difficult to recognize from within. It does not necessarily feel dishonest. It can feel principled. It can feel responsible. It can feel like we're making the hard choice that someone had to make. And when the explanation preserves a way that allows the reasonableness and acceptability of our choices, questioning it can begin to feel like questioning our character, our competence, our care, or our right to have made that choice at all. Having a reason for our choices gives us the context that makes the choice make sense for the circumstances. They allow us to recognize the pressures and limitations and fears and intentions and values and responsibilities and information that were present when a choice was being made. And that reason begins shifting into justification when our explanation no longer helps us reflect or examine the choice and instead begins protecting the choice from examination. The reason becomes a conclusion. Because I was under pressure, my response was acceptable. Because they contributed to the situation, what I chose no longer needs to be questioned. Because my intention was constructive, the result should not carry the same weight. Because the decision was necessary, how it was received, how it was expressed, or even implemented no longer needs to be part of our understanding. And this is where justification can become difficult to separate from discernment. The difference is that discernment remains open to information capable of complicating our choices, while justification begins to organize information around protecting the reason and conclusion. When our mind is discerning, the reason for our choice can remain true without needing to become the only truth that carries influences to our choices. When justification has taken over, the reason begins functioning as permission to stop looking, to stop listening, to let discomfort settle without asking what the settlement required us to exclude. And this is also where compassion can remain present while losing its influence on us. We may still feel some sort of concern. We may still believe we care. We may still experience some sort of sadness or conflict or even regret. But if none of that is allowed to influence how we think, how we choose, how we express ourselves, or how we participate afterwards, justification may already be carrying more authority and power than compassion within our choices. And once justification begins carrying more authority than compassion within our choices, what often strengthens is not a completely false story. It is a story built from parts of the truth that makes our choice feel more acceptable. And this is important because when we think of justification, we may assume that the person must be ignoring the facts or knowingly presenting something that is not true. And that can happen, of course, yes. But many of the justification we will encounter in our day-to-day lives and the lives of others around us are built from circumstances, intentions, the experiences themselves, and concerns that are completely real. We may genuinely have been under pressure. We may genuinely have been trying to help. Another person may genuinely have contributed to the difficulty. The decision may genuinely have protected something important. Our capacity may genuinely have been limited. They may genuinely have been consequences to choosing differently. The challenge is not always whether these are true. The challenge is what happens when we take one part of the truth and allow it to become the explanation for the whole choice. We can say that we had no other option without examining the earlier choices that gradually reduce the options even available to us. We can say our intention was constructive without allowing the way we expressed or implemented that intention to receive any type of examination. We can say that another person needed to learn without asking whether the support we withheld would have prevented that learning, or whether it would have given them enough capacity to learn without being overwhelmed by the circumstances or consequences. We can say that a business decision was necessary without examining whether that necessity emerged from conditions that could have been identified or addressed earlier. We can say that we were protecting a relationship without considering whether the pattern we are protecting was already weakening the relationship from within. And all of these explanations can contain some parts of the truth, but the presence of some parts of the truth does not automatically mean our understanding is complete. The acceptable narrative forms when the part of the truth that supports our choice is allowed to carry more influence than the parts that could contradict or complicate it. And because what we are saying is not necessarily false, we may not experience ourselves as avoiding anything. We may believe we have already considered the situation fully. We may feel that anyone who continues questioning the choice simply does not understand the circumstances, the responsibility we were carrying, or how difficult that decision actually was. Justification gives our choices a meaning we can continue to live with. It allows us to remain connected to the identity we value within ourselves. And when the explanation preserves that sense of ourself, examining it further can feel as though we are being asked to reject the whole of who we are, rather than reconsider one choice or one part of how we participated. And this is also where the acceptable narrative begins changing more than how we understand even that choice itself. It begins changing what we allow ourselves to care about within that choice. Compassion is our capacity to recognize pain, difficulty, vulnerability, limitation, or need within ourselves or another person, and allow that recognition to move us towards care and consideration. And that care does not predetermine what we choose. Compassion does not mean we provide every resource someone asks for. It does not mean we remove every consequence, preserve every relationship, continue every role, or avoid every decision that may bring difficulty into another person's life. We can care and still say no. We can care and still hold a boundary. We can care and still make a difficult business decision. We can care and still recognize that another person has a responsibility for how their own life unfolds. What compassion changes is that the pain, the difficulty, the need, or consequence connected to our choice continues to matter within how we think, how we decide, how we express ourselves, and how we participate in what follows. When justification replaces compassion, our explanation makes the choice acceptable enough that this care is no longer needed to participate. We may know that another person is struggling. We may know that our decision will deepen their struggle. We may know that the consequences will be carried out by someone who has less access, less authority, fewer resources, or little influence over the circumstances that created it. And still, once that justification has settled into the meaning of our choice, that knowledge no longer needs to affect how we move forward, and makes it feel so reasonable and acceptable for us. The pain becomes unfortunate but necessary. The difficulty becomes part of the lesson. The need becomes evidence of dependency or even weakness. The consequence becomes the cost of doing business. This is how we can proceed without experiencing ourselves as uncaring. The justification has already explained why care does not need to change anything. And if we return to that example of someone who has access to a resource another person genuinely needs, compassion will not automatically require that resource be given. There may be important considerations around capacity, sustainability, responsibility, repeated patterns, or whether providing support in that form would truly help. However, if compassion is participating, the actual person and their actual circumstances will start to matter. Their present capacity will start to matter. The seriousness of their need would matter. What alternatives are available to them would matter. Whether they have the stability required to learn from the struggle rather than simply be overwhelmed by it would matter. And what withholding the resource is likely to create in their life would matter. And none of this guarantees that the answer becomes a yes. It just simply means the answer is not allowed to become a no, merely because we found an explanation, a justification for refusing. When we decide that helping would coddle someone, when we stop examining whether that conclusion reflects the person in front of us or a belief we already hold about what people need, we can stop asking whether support and personal responsibility can even exist together. We can stop considering whether the resource would create dependence or provide enough stability for the person to regain their own capacity. And because we have described the refusal as a lesson, we can move forward without caring about the difficulty that person will now carry. The explanation does more than defend the choice. It releases us from compassion. If we believe the difficulty will teach someone, we can treat their suffering as beneficial. If we believe the consequence was unavoidable, we can stop examining what participation or responsibility remains within us. If we believe another person created their own need, we can release ourselves from considering whether we have the capacity to reduce it. If we believe the greater good is being served, we can allow the cost carried by a smaller group to disappear into that larger purpose. The pain remains visible. What disappears is its ability to move us towards compassion. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult parts of this conditioned patterns to recognize. We may still know what another person is experiencing, but knowing pain exists and caring about that pain are not the same experience. Compassion does not require us to reverse every choice that can bring pain. It simply asks us to not use the existence of a reason as permission to become indifferent to the pain connected to what we choose. And when we can no longer find that care, consideration, compassion within how we are expressing, implementing, or carrying that decision, the question is no longer only whether our explanation is reasonable or acceptable to us and the people around us. The deeper question becomes whether the explanation has made the decision acceptable by removing our need to care about its consequence. And now we have reached the close of our episode today. Having a reason for our choices does not automatically mean we are justifying it. Reasons matter. Context matters. Intention matters. Pressure, capacity, responsibility, and the choices available to us at all times, all of them matter. And compassion does not require every difficult choice to become an easier one. Compassion does not require us to say yes when no is what reflects our capacity and integrity. It does not require us to remove consequences, continue access, preserve every relationship, or avoid decisions that may create pain or difficulty for another person. The choice itself may remain unchanged. What changes is whether the pain, the difficulty, the need, or consequence connected to that choice is still allowed to matter to us. When compassion remains present, we're not only aware that a consequence exists, we remain capable of caring about what that consequence means for the person who will carry it. The care can influence how thoroughly we examine our choice, how we express it, and how we implement it, and how we can participate in what follows. When justification replaces compassion, the explanation does something very different. It makes the choice acceptable enough that care is no longer required to influence us. We may acknowledge that someone is struggling and still decide Their struggle is the lesson. We may recognize that employees will lose their livelihoods and reduce their experience to a cost of labor that had to be removed. We may know that our words or actions will deepen another person's pain and still decide that what they did first made that pain less relevant. We may see a need clearly and still conclude that the person created the circumstances themselves, and therefore what happens next is theirs alone to carry. The reason settles the matter to the point that care or compassion becomes irrelevant. And because the explanation may be sincere, factually true, or connected to something we value, we may not recognize that compassion has stopped participating in the choice. And this is why justification can become so difficult for us to see within our own self. It does not always ask us to deny what is happening. It allows us to see the pain and then give that pain a meaning that releases us from caring about it. The pain becomes necessary. The difficulty becomes deserved. The need becomes dependency that must not be supported. The suffering becomes growth. The loss becomes the cost of protecting something larger. And once we give the consequence that meaning, we can continue forward without experiencing ourselves as uncaring. We have an explanation that allows us to remain reasonable, responsible, principled, or even benevolent within our own understanding of the choice. And this does not mean that every difficult decision is a justification. It does not mean that caring requires us to take responsibility for every consequence another person experiences, and it does not mean that compassion must determine the final answer. It simply means that the existence of a convincing reason cannot become our evidence that we have fully discerned our choice. Because our mind can find a way to justify almost anything we want. The choice, the belief, the behavior, the relationship, or outcome, just so it remains acceptable. What helps us recognize the conditioned pattern is not only the strength of the reason, it is what happens when our care or compassion after the reason is accepted. Does the pain connected to our choice still affect how we participate? Does another person's difficulty still matter even when we believe the decision is necessary? Does their need remain relevant even when we are not able to or willing to meet it? Does the consequence remain something we are prepared to carry responsibility for, even when another person also contributed to how that scenario formed? Or has our explanation made the choice so acceptable by removing the need for compassion to influence us at all? These are not easy considerations. They ask us to remain open to the possibility that a reason can be true without being complete, that a decision can be necessary without every part of how we reached or carried it to be aligned, and that we can care about what another person will experience without abandoning our own discernment, limits, and responsibility of ourselves. And now I want to invite all of us to sit with a few reflections. Where in our life have we formed an explanation that has made a choice feel so acceptable that the connected pain, difficulty, need, or consequence no longer influenced us? What meaning have we given that consequence? Have we called it a lesson, a necessity, accountability, the greater good, or simply the cost of that decision? And what has that meaning allowed us to stop caring about? Now, as always, I would love for us to continue this reflection together. Please share your perspectives and experiences through the platform you're listening from. so all of us can continue learning and deepening our understanding. And please share this episode with anyone you believe might find value in sitting with this conditioned pattern or even the journey we've been taking this entire season. In our next episode, episode 25, we will turn towards when our self becomes our anchor. We will explore what it means for ourself to become that internal reference point from which we meet pressure, relationships, expectations, and the choices life asks us to make. Not as a permanent state we are arriving at, but as an orientation we can remain connected to and return to when we move throughout our lives. Thank you for joining me today. I am your host, Gayatri. And until next time, let us continue strengthening our mind. Remain honest about what our explanations are allowing us to accept and ensuring that our reasons do not release us from the compassion our choices may ask us to carry.